been blessed in secular life and pursuits to appreciate positions of leadership as well as positions where I was in submission to leaders. And so having been in those circumstances, it's easy for somebody like me to look at leadership and have a little bit more balanced viewpoint than perhaps someone who has never been in those positions. One of the things that I have noted about leadership is that for some reason in many pursuits, when you are a leader, what that means is on your back is a very large, bright target, bullseye painted on your back, because as a leader, people tend to have expectations. They tend to think that more should be expected of you as a leader than not. And in some regard that's true, but in some regard it is sometimes an artificial placement of an individual beyond their station. Now, one of the benefits of placing someone beyond their station is it's easy to knock them down. You know, to him who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. Okay? But one of the things that I do note about the text we're looking at here in Numbers 16 is that Moses was one of the meekest men to ever live in his era. The Bible says so. And believing the Bible, I can tell you that was quite a chore in the group of people he was associated with, because God's people had a penchant for arrogance. Very often it is the case as they come across and escape the Egyptians through the Red Sea that a lot of the issues and problems they had to do with a lack of submission. And I guess that's a natural thing for humanity, and it's that way specifically or particularly in a country like ours and a culture like ours, where we have a lot of folks who know their rights usually better than they know what's expected of them and what the rules are and the laws. They know their rights. And so therefore, a lot of folks think more highly of themselves than they ought to. One of the problems I see Moses facing here in chapter 16, and this is another case where were we to study the entire event, it would take way too long. It'd be a great Bible study to be had over the course of several Bible studies, because this is a turning point. It's a very important incident that occurs during the course of Moses' leadership. And one of the things that happens here is that several men decide that they're not happy with the leadership. Now, when somebody's not happy with leadership, well, the first thing you do is you go straight to the leader and you sit down and in a civil tone, you talk to them about the shortcomings you feel they have so that you can work out your problems, right? No. First thing you do is you assemble a mob of some sort so that it looks like that your side is the one that people ought to be on. And that's what you find here. It is very often the case, in fact, I've said this all during my preaching career, if you've got a problem with me, come talk to me. You will find me to be very easygoing, and we can talk about things, and I'll sit and listen to you. And if there's any grounds at all to your complaint against me, I'll do what I can to fix it, because I'm not the head of the church. We don't baptize in the name of Jeff. This is not who I am. I'm merely a conduit through which the gospel is given to you. That's all that I am. I'm nothing special whatsoever. And so therefore, when I make mistakes, and I say when, not if, because I do make mistakes, I really appreciate somebody coming up in gentleness and kindness and saying, Jeff, you blew it. I can handle that, because I can get over that, I can figure out what's wrong, and I can fix it. What I don't appreciate, and what no leader appreciates, is gathering up a mob that you've been running the mouth for a good long while, and you got a bunch of posse over here, and bring the whole posse up and say, Jeff, there's 30 of us here, and we just voted we don't like you. Nobody likes that kind of thing, particularly if you're in a leadership position. And so Moses is being approached, and I want you to note in verse 2, this is no small mutiny that's happening here. The children of Israel have a streak that God has to deal with, and of course Moses has to deal with, and their streak has a lot to do with not being able to be in submission like they should. Moses is merely a mouthpiece for God. He's merely telling them what God said they're supposed to do. But yet you'll find within the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation. This is not 250 soreheads out here. These are leaders of the people. So if you want to look at the amount of people who are discontented, 250 merely represents the leaders of however many people were following them. So there's quite a discontent here. But what's interesting is how they approach Moses and Aaron. I want you to notice the flaws that very often come up when somebody has no grounds, but they want to make a fight where there's no fight to be made. Notice in verse 3, they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. They didn't come to them individually. And by the way, if you read your Bible in Matthew, the 18th chapter, there's some specific instructions given beginning around verse 15. You can fact check me on that one. But there's some specific instructions about how we deal with our problems. And that refers to the issue between me and David here. We're going to talk things out, but we start on an individual level. That's where you start with your problems. I really appreciated an eldership back in Jacksonboro when somebody threw a shoe and got upset about something and came to the elders and said, "Oh, we got issues and problems with Jeff." And their first question, all 6 elders, their first question, "Have you talked to Jeff yet?" "Well, no." They said, "No problem. Go talk to Jeff first, and then come back." And then we settled it. We solved the problem, and it really ended up being not so big a problem at all. Very easily solved. This is what happens, though, when you get a bunch of people in a mob, and you take them up and try to challenge leadership, and you don't have a ground to stand on. Here are some of the things that are said. I want to dissect their statement, their introduction to this conflict. Okay? They start, "You take too much upon yourself." Now this is a premise upon which they build their argument that's flawed. To begin with, it is not Moses who appointed himself. Do you recall the Bible description of how Moses was called into duty to go into Egypt? Remember the burning bush incident, where the bush was burning and he turned aside from his shepherding to go over to the bush and was told, "Take your flip-flops off because you're standing on holy ground." And so he goes up there and God tells him, "I want you to go over to Egypt and free my people." And Moses said, "You bet you God, I'm on your side. Let's get her done." Oh, well, that's not right. That's not how it happened. Moses was the most reticent leader you'll ever find. He was not ready to lead. I mean, he didn't hide like Saul did, King Saul, but he did say, "Oh, I can't do it. In fact, I can't even talk right." And God said, "Who made your mouth?" And anyway, he accommodated and he got Moses where he needed to be. Moses was not that kind of person. "I'm going to take charge here. I want you to know I'm taking charge, and I'm going to be the boss. Thank you very little." That's not how Moses was. And so to begin with, their assertion is you take too much upon yourself is false based on the fact that they are assigning his leadership position to himself and not to God. And I want to tell you something, anytime, and this is going to circle around later on to leadership in the church, anytime you begin to desubmit, I don't know if that's a word, to an eldership or leadership of any kind, you're messing with God. You're not just messing with the men who are tasked with the leadership. You're messing with God. We should be very cautious about how we go about suggesting and talking to and approaching leadership in the church of our Lord. We need to be very respectful. We need to understand that they are not there because of who they are per se, but who God requires them to be. Timothy was told there's a whole bunch of qualifications here that if a man isn't qualified, he cannot be a bishop or an elder. And so therefore a person is in the leadership position because of the qualifications God set forth. In this particular instance, it's more direct even than that, as God chose Moses personally. Their assertion that you take too much on yourself is totally baseless, considering the fact that God is the one who chose Moses. And so God chose Moses to be a leader. And then, of course, as any lie must have to be at least tenable, acceptable in some way, it has to be sprinkled with truth, right? I mean, the bare-faced, total, complete lie will never work. Satan is never going to tell you, don't go to church. He's just going to tell you, sleep during church. Don't pay attention during church. Don't care, and don't live like that when you get outside the church doors. That's what he's going to tell you. He's not going to tell you don't go to church. Don't go to a worship assembly. And so, therefore, here's the little bit of it sprinkled in with this falsehood. For all the congregation is holy, every one of them. Is that true? Yes, it is. But you know the funny thing about it? That has no bearing on the fact that they were still, as holy as they are, every one of them, still supposed to be in submission to Moses' word, because Moses was speaking for God. I get tickled sometimes at the arguments people make, because very often it is the case that people will make a statement of fact that has no bearing at all on the argument, the conflict or the controversy that's being discussed. In other words, you make a statement, and I get tickled because sometimes it's a statement that's so far-fetched and so disjointed, disconnected with the argument at hand, you're wondering, where did that come from? I mean, we could talk about the fact we need to listen to truth, and the world is round, and we need to listen to truth. What does the world is round have to do with that? Well, there's a connection. It's remote, to be sure. But throwing that in there sounds like, well, I'm stating something as fact, which by extension means what I stated before is fact. And that's not necessarily true. The fact that they are pointing out that all the congregation is holy, every one of them, is true. As a matter of fact, further on, and the Lord is among them. That's true too. But that has no bearing on the fact that the assertion that Moses is taking too much on him has nothing to do with these facts. And then you go further, again, with the personal assault. This is usually what happens when leadership is attacked. It usually gets very personal. Our politics are no exception to the rule. This has been going on forever. Slinging mud is so much more effective than dealing with the issues. Have you ever noticed that? I mean, you don't have to really deal with an issue if you just make a guy stink bad enough. People don't care what he says because he stinks. And so if you can make him stink, then you don't have to worry about the actual issues that are at hand. Their rebellion here is what's at hand, and yet they're saying here, why then do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? Well, that's just slinging mud, because Moses never did that. In fact, if you look further, that's what happens. I mean, what happens next is a very telling sign. It says in the next verse, so then Moses heard it, or when Moses heard it, he got upset and argued back with them. No, he did not. His disappointment was overwhelming because they missed it so far. He just fell on his face. It's like incredulous. It's unbelievable. I can't believe they're taking it this way. And so therefore he goes into an argument with them and tells them in verse 7, you take too much upon yourselves, you sons of Levi. He is explaining to them the very thing that you are asserting about me is really true about you. Now, this is an interesting phenomenon here, because it is the case that when people don't want to be submissive to leadership, isn't it an irony that when they take over as leader, they sure do expect you to submit to their leadership? That's just almost funny if it weren't so sad. And yet here's what they're saying, and Moses responds. He says, you take too much upon yourself. A little further down, Moses then begins to explain to them their place. He does so with expressions. Is it a small thing to you? He says that twice in verse 9 and in verse 13. Well, except in verse 13, it's them mocking him coming back. But in verse 9, is it a small thing to you that God, the God of Israel, has separated you from the congregation of Israel? You Levites have a connection with God that the whole church does not. The whole people does not. I say the church of Israel in using that term. He said the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself to do the work of the tabernacle of the Lord. See, Levites could do stuff not the rest of the Israelites could do. Except that wasn't enough for them. And here's another indicator of people who don't like to submit. What they have and the responsibility they have isn't enough for them. They want more. They want to run things. That reminds me of 2 John and a fellow by the name of Diotrephes. Long study about that. We won't get into it this afternoon, but there's an interesting study in how someone becomes a doctor of peace. Because they don't start out that way, but individuals in leadership very often become doctor of peace because they want to run the show. They want to have all the control. And yet, as a good leader, you understand that God is in control, and what you have is given to you by God. These Levites who were rebelling were told, God is the one who put you in the place you are in right now, and you should be appreciative of that, not reaching and grasping for more and more leadership and authority. Anyway, therefore, in verse 11, you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. And that's the profound statement of this entire conflict. You think you're coming against me because you think, or you're asserting, that I'm wanting to have control and be the top dog, and that's not the case. But what you don't realize is you're not fighting against me, you're fighting against God. This is a platform from which all non-submission comes from. If you don't want to submit to the eldership, you're fighting against God, not the guys that are elders. If you don't want to be submissive to the laws of this country, you're not fighting against this country, you're fighting against God. Romans 13:1 and following. If you don't want to do what God says, you're fighting against God. And his apostles, his teachers, his inspired writers, when they write something for us to understand and follow and accept and apply, if we decide not to do it, we're not dissing Paul. I get tickled. Some of the guys with all the letters behind their name talk about how Paul was this way and Peter was that way, and you can discount some of what Paul said because of who he was, and he hated women, and on they go. You're not fighting against Paul. Diminishing Paul doesn't change the inspired writings. You're fighting against God. And so therefore, they respond to him in verse 13. Is it a small thing that you brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey? And that's what he is. They're referencing Egypt that way. That's another misnomer. To kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep on acting like a prince over us? Moses never did that. Now we know the end of the story, right? We know the end of the account, how things happen. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were all told to come out here to meet us. Well, Korah showed up, Dathan and Abiram did. They stayed there at tents, and that didn't work because they were swallowed up too. But Korah came out, and Moses said, okay, God's going to show you something new, and we'll find out who he listens to. I would love to have been there. Not because of the rubbernecking gore and all that kind of thing, but I would just love to have been there to see the looks on the people's faces who are standing by witnessing what happens to people who do not submit to authority. I don't know whether you've ever seen something traumatic happen. It marks your life. It has quite a profound effect on you. Here are all the children of Israel standing there, and here's Moses and Aaron on one side, and Korah and his batch over here on the other, and all of a sudden, the earth opens up, and Korah and all of his disappear, and the earth closes up over it. That, to me, would have made a profound imprint on my memory of what happens when you don't submit to God. There are lots of reasons. This is just one instance in many in the Old Testament where the children of Israel refused to submit to God. God handled it in various and sundry ways. These things were written for our learning and admonition. The rubber meets the road when we get to the church today, and God has set things up in a way that he wants things done. So therefore, when you look at the oldest institution on the planet, the family, marriage and the family, you have a hierarchy in the family. Oh, I know that goes against culture, but men, you need to step up and love your wives as you love yourself, and be willing to sacrifice yourself for your wife as Jesus did for the church. But ladies, you need to be submissive to your husbands. Not a popular thing to tell in modern culture these days, but it's the truth. And here's the thing: once that relationship is twisted or something else becomes of it, it's not acceptable to God, and you're not dissing your husbands, ladies, when you don't submit. You're fighting against God. When you get in the church, we have an eldership. God knew men were men and they were imperfect, but when he put elderships in charge of his bodies as they meet, we're supposed to be in submission to our eldership. We're supposed to support them. We're supposed to help them. And when it comes down to it, unless they start pushing the piano up into the front of the church building or doing some doctrinal thing that's wrong, If they decide we need stained glass instead of clear glass, let's go with it. Let's be in support of them. Let's submit to our eldership. Because if we don't, we're fighting against God. I know for a fact the elders are doing a wonderful job of trying to do lots of things a lot better. And they're trying to help this congregation grow. And we're starting a new year here pretty soon, and there's going to be some new things that kind of go into effect. And we need to be supportive, because if we are not, we're fighting against God. Not just a bunch of these good old boys that are around here and in charge. They're just leaders here in the church. But we need to respect and be in submission to our elders. And when it really comes down to it, it's not a hard thing to do when you get to it. Because if we all work together in unity, we won't have the problems. Now, I will say with some great confidence, if you cross our eldership, the ground here at Hamilton probably won't open up and swallow you. We had some pretty sizable cracks last year in the summer when it was really, really hot in the ground, but I fell in one, but I didn't completely go all the way down. So I think that's the worst it's going to get. But you know, these are written for our learning and admonition. And we need to be aware that when we don't submit as God would have us to submit, then we're not pleasing God and we're fighting against God. So I would encourage us all, support our elders, encourage them, support each other, because we're to be in submission to one another. Look out for each other's good. And wives, submit to your husbands, and husbands, love your wives. And children, be obedient to your parents. And when you get all that together, a culture, a society will work properly, because it's the way God set it up to work. This is a great lesson for us in submission. If you're not in submission to God right now, we offer an invitation song to allow you an opportunity to submit yourself to His authority. If you need to do so, in whatever way you need to do so now as we stand.